Welcome to Millennium Counseling Center's podcast, where each week we go in depth into all things mental health, addiction recovery, and being our healthiest and happiest self. Enjoy. Okay, so before we were pressing record, we're talking a little bit about change and transitions in life and big changes and little changes. What are some things that you're seeing with clients and how they're figuring out change and ultimately just kind of what's happening emotionally as they're kind of contemplating all the different things that are happening in their life?
Yeah, I think when you talk about change or transition, you're talking about kind of big curves in life that are different than what our expectations were. So if you're talking about moving, right, you have an expectation that you're going to stay in the same place. If you're talking about ending a relationship or you're talking about changing major behaviors in your life, like recovery. And so I think that that's scary and it, for many people, gives a lot of feeling of anxiety. And I think that learning how to navigate through that in a positive, productive way is oftentimes very important. And I think the idea of what that's going to take is big and scary. But if you have some kind of processes in place to do that, then I think that can be really helpful so that it doesn't feel like so disruptive in your life.
Yeah, I would say that probably where I start with clients when they come in and talking about change is kind of where are you right now and where is your head? So the differences between how does it feel sitting in this space right now versus kind of where is your mind taking you in terms of kind of what are you projecting out, what it's going to be, how it's going to feel, how disruptive it's going to be, and really help them kind of learn how to be more in the present space rather than in what they think something may be like.
Yeah, and I think a big piece of that is, in the word judgment is, I think, or prediction, I guess, is when something happens in our life, we generally want to try to categorize it as a good thing or a bad thing. And I think that I prefer to categorize them into things that I want or things that I don't want. But I think if just because I want it doesn't mean it's a good thing or doesn't mean it's the best thing for me. And I think that when we make this decision, I'll use, let's say, divorce, for example, you go through a divorce and, in your brain, you're saying, this is bad. This is a bad thing. This is not something good. Now, for many people, going through a breakup or something like that turns out to be a very good thing in their life. We just don't know what that is yet. And so I always encourage people to reserve judgment on whether something is good or bad because we don't have the ability to know how that's going to turn out. It's an unknown. And because of that, if we've automatically categorized these things as good or bad, then we're going to push back against doing that and we won't transition into it. So it kind of limits the opportunity for it to turn out better if you can stay, kind of open-minded and another word you and I talked about a lot, curious as to what that's going to look like and trying to maximize the positive things from it. Then I think that it leaves a space for you to be able to really kind of engage in that instead of kind of resisting that change.
Yeah. I would say terminologies I use quite a bit with clients is familiar or comfortable. And I think that one thing that I've noticed is familiar or comfortable doesn't always have to mean like healthy. So one of the things about change is it may not feel familiar or comfortable because you're used to what you're used to. And that may mean it's unfamiliar to not do a certain behavior or not ingest a certain substance or not be with somebody or be with somebody. And so making changes is really disruptive to what's familiar or comfortable, where we tend to find ourselves. And that's kind of what we all do as humans is find a state where we are kind of the most comfortable. And then life happens and we have to kind of adapt to new situations.
Yeah, and I agree with those words. And I think familiar is a very good one. And I think that you're right. It doesn't need to be healthy behaviors that are familiar. You can have unhealthy behaviors, or you can have, depression can be familiar, or anxiety can be familiar, or substance use can be familiar. Those are things that we know. And, most of the time, if you're going to make a change in your life, you are going to have to do something that is not familiar or that is uncomfortable for you. And I kind of look at like how fitness works, where running 10 miles, right? That's not comfortable. It's hard and it hurts and it makes you sore, but we're willing to do it because we believe that the change that that will make is worth that. So we're willing to be uncomfortable because we believe in that the idea of what that will look like in the future. That's an easier one to do because you believe in the fact that, okay, if I go run 10 miles every day, I'm going to get more fit or I'll be healthier or whatever that is. When we don't know what that future looks like, we don't know for sure that that outcome, or we're not even, really certain that the outcome is going to be something that we believe will be positive in our life, then it's harder to make yourself uncomfortable to go to an unknown than it is to make yourself uncomfortable for something that we believe is a known outcome.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's spot on because a lot of the things that we're asking people to do, or people are coming in and saying, "Hey, I want to do this, but I don't know how to do it, or I need some help with this." There really isn't a clear understanding of what's next to kind of take a big leap in a change in your mental health or behavioral health, relationship health. Yeah, there's really no, you can't predict. So there's huge leaps of faith in that, and that's scary.
Yeah, so when you were saying that, it made me think of that, there's, oh, and this I think has gotten better, but, some people believe that you are who you are, right? You can't change. People are people, and you're always going to be, once a liar, always a liar, those types of things. And whenever I'm having a conversation with somebody who will say something like that, my first answer is, I hope not. I hope it's not true because if so, then, first of all, it's what we spend most of our time doing is helping people change something. They come to us, they've got something they want to work on and they want to do something differently, think differently, feel differently, whatever that is, but also in our own lives, right? Like if people can't change, then I have a really troubling future in front of me because my strong belief is that people can and are able to change as long as you're willing and open-minded and curious.
Yeah. I remember a long time ago when you and I had a conversation where some of the quote unquote hardest things that we have been through are looking back now is some of the kind of the best things that may have ever happened to us, whether it's a medical thing or a relationship ending or a big change. And I'll never forget that conversation because it was like validating to hear that someone else views the times in their life where there was a lot of upheaval and uncertainty, but then looking back even just a few years after that and been like, man, if that didn't happen, I wouldn't have all these other things that only would have occurred because of that change.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the cornerstones of, a lot of what I kind of build within recovery in the recovery world is that, and one of the things I used to say all the time was, your worst day could turn out to be your best day. And it kind of goes back to what I was talking about before is that something happens. It's not what we want to happen. So we create a judgment. We say, this is good, this is bad. But the thing I always encourage people to do is, somebody will say, hey, I'm going through a breakup. I'm going to be very lonely, or I'm always going to be sad now, or whatever they're saying. And I always include the word maybe. I say, maybe, that might be true. And it also might not be true, right? It might be that whatever this next thing is going to lead you to something that is even better or greater than where you came from. So it's not the case that everything that seems bad turns out good, but it's also not the case that everything that seems bad turns out bad. And that's why I love the word maybe is when our brain tells us something, when we are going through some change and our brain says, oh no, this is going to be dot, 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 then we say, maybe, let's wait and see. Time will tell. But I can tell you that for all of us is that there are things in our lives. If you think back to these things, and I encourage people to do this, think back to something in your life that in the moment you were sure was a terrible thing. And it turned out to be different from that. It either turned out to be a really good thing or it turned out to be not nearly as bad as you thought it would be. We have to remind ourselves of those things when in the moment something happens that feels negative. We have to leave that space for the outcome may very well be different than what we're thinking in that moment. And I believe that's how you get there. I believe that just having the willingness to say maybe leaves the pathway for potentially it to turn out to be something very positive.
Yeah. Well, and I think a couple things come up for me with that. One is the transitional part from one thing to another thing, this middle is harder, right? It's unfamiliar, it's uncomfortable. You're learning something new, you're adapting to something. And so that part could potentially be harder. But ultimately, you will end up somewhere that then becomes familiar. And so for me, I like to differentiate a little bit between change in terms of the different parts of it. So the early stages, and then kind of ultimately where you get to in terms of your new normal. The other thing that comes up for me is kind of, and I was reminded it recently watching an episode of Ted Lasso, is, all media that we consume, all movies normally follow the same script, a three-part script, where you have the introduction, phase one, you have phase two, where there's some kind of crisis or problem, and then you have the outcome three, third part of the formula, where it's kind of how everything gets figured out. And so in our lives, we are in various parts of stage one, two, or three. And if we're in a stage two, if we're in the kind of the dark forest or we're in the figuring it out, the harder part, that there will be an act three for that thing. And I think all we need to really kind of look at is all the other parts of our lives where we've been through the part two and now we're in a part three. I mean, that's for me just another way that I think about it is in order to get to the good part three, where we all feel really good at the end of a Pixar movie or any movie really, that we're only there really because of kind of the crisis moment that they had to go through in the middle part of the movie.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the other part that can be confusing about this is I think that we have the ability to affect where these things go by the decisions we make, the behaviors we have, the way we, kind of navigate things. We have some say in how these things turn out, but we don't have full control. And so I think that as you're going through these things, I think starting with, you identify something that is going to need to change. Many times when that happens, we feel like we're worried about the change, we're afraid of the change. We identify what that is, then we stay open to the fact that the outcome could be a wide range of things. It could end up even something that we think is a bad thing turns out to be really a good thing. So even if we do have the outcome that we're afraid of, that might actually not turn out to be what we think it is. But then also understanding that it's a combination of us having the ability to affect these outcomes and to help steer this in the right direction. And at the same time, understanding that we don't have full control over figuring out what that's going to look like and where we go. So I think that just making the best decisions we can, trying to stay open-minded, somewhat positive, although a lot of times when you're feeling like that, it's really hard to stay positive. So what I always encourage people to do is stay neutral and then be engaged in trying to work towards the outcomes you're looking for, but also understanding that sometimes that's beyond our control. And then we just have to do the best we can do to get there and then kind of evaluate it at a later date, because in the real time, it's really hard to evaluate whether something is positive or negative.
Yeah. You can sometimes score more goals and lose, and sometimes score less goals and win. And so it really kind of is a lot about the process and a lot about kind of how you're navigating it, less so about kind of ultimately the final kind of outcome or product.
Yep, absolutely. And in my playing days, I had one particular coach, which I've learned to take on in my own coaching, but who, after every game, the only question he would ask me is, were you the hardest working player on the field? He wasn't concerned with what the score was or how well we played or did we make mistakes. But his idea was that the way I was going to be the best possible version of myself as a player is that I had to be the hardest working player on the field. And so that was always the single first question he asked me, whether I had scored 3 goals or got shut out. That wasn't his concern. It was that essentially, did I give my full effort and did I do everything that I needed to do to try to get the outcomes I'm looking for?
Yeah. Well, and then just coming back to the work that we're doing with clients, it's what is in your control, right? Whether you lose your job or have a relapse or somebody doesn't want to be in a relationship anymore, a lot of those things can be out of our control. But kind of really circling back to what is in our control on a day-to-day basis, and how do you reflect on that? How do you try to remain accountable to those things and be honest with people about those things? And I guess it's not about perfectionism and being the hardest working person every single day of your life, but it's about recognizing that, that's what we're striving for. And when you're having a hard time with that, getting support and learning how to be honest and vulnerable about the times that it's harder to show up in your best ways.
Yeah, and that goes back to one of my favorite sayings, right? Which is control the controllables. And if we identify the things that we have an ability to affect in our life or control, whatever word you want to use, and we put most of our focus and effort into those things and trying to do those things in the healthiest way possible. Oftentimes you see people get sidetracked when they're spending more time and energy on trying to control things that they don't have control over, like someone else or other people's behaviors or those types of things. We spend all this effort on trying to make things turn out the way we want to or make people act the way we want to. But what I've learned in my own life is that the more I'm focusing on the things that I can actually positively affect in my life, that is going to lead me to better outcomes than, I kind of look at that if I'm spending time and energy trying to control something that I absolutely know I have no control over, then there's really no value in that for me. And it's just lost energy and brain space that I could be putting into something that I could actually influence the outcome.